let's talk about dynamic range, compressors, and why these things are so important in getting our mixes to compete with professional mixes. I'm Keith from No Label, No Producer, No Limits.com. Let's dive right in. Dynamic range is simply the difference between the quietest part of something and the loudest part of something. With the human voice, that's from a whisper to a scream. Now, if someone was standing in front of us and they were whispering as quietly as possible, we might not be able to hear it. We might have to lean in. Then if they screamed, it would hurt our ears and we'd be forced to shove them out of the airlock into outer space where no one could hear them. Now, if we wanted to record that, we would have to limit the dynamic range. We'd have to narrow it down because we want to hear the whisper, but we don't want the scream to be too loud. And the same is true with music. We don't want to have to go over to our stereo and turn up the quiet parts and then turn down the loud parts. So typically what we have to do is narrow the dynamic range down. But if you take too much dynamic range out, you remove some of the emotion of the music. Part of the emotion is from the rise and fall of volume. So we need to hit a range where we're limiting dynamic range, but not too much. Now, the main tool that we have to limit dynamic range is called a compressor. A compressor narrows dynamic range by turning down the peak or the loudest signals. A compressor only turns down signals above the threshold, and the threshold is indicated by this red line here. I can change where the threshold comes in. Let's set the threshold at -3 or so. It turns down these highest levels based on the ratio. At 1:1, for every 1 dB that comes into the input of the compressor, it allows 1 dB out. In other words, it doesn't change anything. At 3:1, turning it up here to about 3:1, for every 3 dB that comes into the compressor above the threshold, the compressor only allows 1 dB through. So in this way, the peaks are closer to the quietest sounds. So you've narrowed the dynamic range. Now, most compressors have a makeup or an output gain knob. And watch what happens. We can turn this back up to where the peak sounds are about 0. But now the quietest sounds are louder. Now, I'm not suggesting that you do exactly this. This is just a demonstration. So in short, there's a threshold. Signals above the threshold are turned down based on the ratio. That's the way that you narrow dynamic range. Now, you can't push an unlimited amount of level to Spotify, a CD manufacturer, the radio, TikTok, wherever. In general, they don't want to see anything above 0 dB peak. Now, let's represent that with this beautiful kitchen device, the cup. 0 dB being the top of the cup. You can't keep pouring liquid into the cup, otherwise the vodka will spill out all over your mom's new friend's expensive furniture and bad things will happen. Now, let's suppose that you've mixed a song and the average level of the song is right about here. But you've got a snare drum that comes up to 0 dB. It's hitting the peaks. Now, you send this mix off to Spotify or YouTube, and they can't turn it up anymore. Neither can you. If you turn it up, you will go above 0 dB, where bad things happen. Now, you give this mix to Pat, the mastering engineer. They take a look at it and they say, I think I'm going to put a threshold right about here, and we will bring these peaks down. So they bring the peaks down closer to the rest of the music. Then you can turn the overall mix up. So the peaks aren't any louder, they're just closer, and the quieter parts are louder, so the average volume of the mix has gone up. Pat's version is going to sound louder. Your version is going to sound like, well, as a record company producer once described my music, wimp rock for losers. I'm not bitter at all. We can also use compression to raise the overall volume. Now, the pros know how to do this, know how to squeeze the dynamic range down without squeezing the life out of the song. In fact, it tends to add excitement. Let's see how that looks in a waveform. A limiter is a special form of compression which acts as a safety. It's like putting a plastic lid on that cup that we talked about earlier. And its job is to keep anything from going over the threshold. Usually it's a compressor with a ratio set at 20:1 or greater. And usually it's the last thing in your signal flow out of the mix. Like when you're mastering, you're going to have a limiter in the final stage. And let's take a look at what a limiter looks like in terms of a waveform. Okay, I have some professionally done mixes here. Let's take a look at them a little bit. The first one I want to pull up is Gasoline by Audioslave. And you can see this is what limiting looks like. It looks like a flat line right across the top. And you zoom in, you see a little bit more variance. But essentially, nothing goes beyond the top of that limiter. And the loud parts are pretty much crushed with it. And we have some dynamics here. You know, there's the part where it breaks down and ding, 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 ding. And that's probably right here. Now, up above, we have Jewel, a completely different genre with a great song, incredible production. The song is called Standin' Still, and you can see it's a little bit more dynamic than Gasoline, but still, the loud parts pretty much have a haircut. It looks like the top of my electric razor. Down below, Mumford & Sons, I Will Wait, once again, pretty much cut off there in the louder parts of the song. But you can see, again, you can see there are quieter parts of the song which are not limited. Good is Good, Sheryl Crow. And if we look at Sheryl Crow and Mumford & Sons together, it looks like Mumford & Sons actually has a little bit more dynamics than the Sheryl Crow song, which does have kind of a breakdown part, which I believe is right here. And finally, we have Alice in Chains with Rooster, which has a long, soft introduction. And then it's not as hard crushed as some of these others, even though the song is probably, except for maybe Gasoline, the hardest driving song of the bunch. So that's what compression and especially limiting can look like in a final mix. Let's see what it looks like on a meter. I have Standin' Still in front of me, and I'm going to open up something called the Loudness Analyzer from Melda Productions. This bundle is free. There will be a link below. Now, when I start playing the song here, you'll see this bottom area after 3 seconds will start to show you. And the width of this meter shows you how much dynamic range there is. So right now, 6.8 loudness units, I assume LU stands for. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the width here or the number here. And you can compare your song to these professionally produced songs. If your song has a lot more dynamic range, you'll need to tighten it down a little bit. Now, this takes a 3-second sample, I believe. One of the important places to listen would be the chorus when everything is flat out as loud as it's going to get. So let's see what we got in the chorus. Takes a few seconds to kick in. As you can see, this is very tight, very narrow dynamic range in the chorus. I wouldn't necessarily go this tight. Let's take a look now in the breakdown part. This is still pretty tight. Okay, now it's widening up a little bit. 6-7 loudness units. Let's do this with another song. We're going to take Gasoline here from Audioslave. And so this is the breakdown part into the louder parts. Let's see what happens. It's pretty tight. And now as we kick into the louder parts, obviously there's a change in dynamics, so it will appear wide. But we still have a fairly tight, around 7 loudness units. And by now, I think we're probably into the chorus. Yeah. So if we pull this into a super loud part where everything is going full blast, you're going to see it's pretty tight in terms of dynamics. Now, the reason that I showed you Loudness Analyzer is that it's available in multiple formats. It's free. I've got two other free options, but they won't work for everyone. One is the TT Dynamic Range Meter, and it's the one that I use. And the reason I use it is because it shows the dynamic range very plainly. If you look right here at these lines in the center, they show you dynamic range. As we get into the chorus, let's take it back to a chorus here. You'll see it tightens up pretty well in the red, and it gives you also a numerical value, which you can compare to your reference mixes. Now, it's only available in 32-bit, so if you can't run 32-bit plugins, you're out of luck. If you have Reaper, you can use the JS Loudness Meter. And you can see this section right here, this backwards C. The distance between the top and the bottom part of the C is your dynamic range, and it also gives you a numerical value. And if I pop this on the chorus, once again, it's going to tighten up significantly. You can see the dynamic range is very tight there. So those are two other options. If you have Reaper, JS Loudness Meter, if you can run 32-bit plugins, the TT Dynamic Range Meter is available for you. If you can't run either of those, the Loudness Analyzer does a great job. It works just fine. I just find this a little bit easier to see. Now, what I recommend that you do with metering for dynamic range is take a look at two parts of a song. Take a look at a chorus where everything is going full blast and see where the dynamic range is. And your mix should be in the ballpark of your reference mix. Do the same thing maybe with a quieter part of a song, a part of the song that is not loud enough to hit the limiter, and look at your dynamic range there too, and it should be in the ballpark of the dynamic range of the quieter parts of your song. Now, this part of the song hasn't hit the limiter, so if it has too wide of a dynamic range, you're going to have to go back to your compression on your buses and the individual instruments to tighten it up a little bit. If it doesn't have much in the way of dynamics at all, you might have to loosen those up a little bit. Let me show you how to use a limiter. Now, a limiter should be the last thing in the chain in your mix. I've got a meter after it, but a meter shouldn't change the sound. I've called up LoudMax, which is free. Now, here's how you use LoudMax. You put it as the last thing in your chain. You make sure these faders are linked. And you play the loudest part of your song. And you pull the threshold down, and you'll start to see some gain reduction over here. Now, what you want to do is listen to the most forward element of the mix, the loudest thing, and make sure it's not taking the sparkle out of that thing. In other words, if it's your snare, listen to the snare hit, the impact. Make sure you're not squashing the snare too much. If you're looking for maximum level, pull this threshold all the way down until you hear it degrading the sound, and then back off a little bit. Now, once you get this threshold to where you want it, to where it sounds good, unlink the faders, and then pull this up to, say, -1. Now, so you've got a little compression going on here, a little limiting going on here, and nothing is going to go out above -1. Then you can take a look at your metering and see where you are in terms of dynamic range compared to your reference mixes. Now, I'm limiting something, this Jewel song, Standing Still. I'm limiting it, and it's already been limited, so obviously it's going to have a super tight dynamic range. But you get the idea. Now, if there's too much dynamic range, go ahead and pull this threshold down a little bit. If that damages the quality of the song, you're going to have to go back to your buses and your individual tracks and tighten them down a little bit. Now, one of the ways that you can do that is by raising the ratio, turn the ratio up a little bit, or you can lower the threshold so that the compression starts a little bit sooner. Your third alternative, of course, this is always based on your ears. So if it sounds good, you can let it go. In general, what you want to do is shoot for the same level of dynamic range as your favorite mixes have. Let's talk about how this changes if you're sending your tracks away to be mixed or mastered. If you're sending your individual instrument stems off to a mixing engineer, then in general, you don't want to compress. You want to leave those choices to that person. That's what you pay them for. Unless compression is an integral sound of a particular instrument, then go ahead and do it. In terms of mastering, if you are mixing things yourself, but sending it off to be mastered, go ahead and compress the individual instruments, go ahead and compress your buses, but leave the final two stages off. Don't compress your master and don't limit your master. Again, that's what you pay the mastering engineer for, to use their gear and their knowledge in those stages. If you're watching on social media, like, subscribe, share, you know what to do. Leave a comment. Now, on my webpage, which will be in the description or in the first comment, there's more information about this subject. There's links to the free downloads of resources like Loudmax, which is free and you can download and use it yourself. This is Keith from No Label, No Producer, No Limits.com. See you soon.